I'm just going to make the comment that we are testing patients. So primary care is seeing patients every day who meet the case definition or potentially might have been exposed. And so those patients are being tested. So it's not that there's no surveillance going on in the community, and we haven't seen any cases yet in Canterbury, which is fantastic.
So yeah, I'm just going to reiterate that. I think it's unlikely, it's not impossible, but I think it's unlikely that there's sort of silent spread in the community now. So I don't think that's a likely scenario to be happening right now, because as Sarah says, we're doing quite a lot of testing in the community, and primary care are very alert to this, and I think the general public are pretty alert as well.
Thanks, Josh. Another question?
I know I'm only allowed one question, but I've actually got two, so I want to get them in really quickly. I want to know how beneficial the pneumonia vaccine would be to our elderly who especially have, say, COPD or diabetes, heart disease. And my second question is, if I've got it, can I pass it to my pet? Can my pet pass it to livestock? Thank you.
I'm obviously the vaccine person. With regard to the pneumonia vaccine itself, that one is, the short story is we actually have two types of vaccines, and the one is one that's used in adults, and it's not the perfect vaccine, but it is recommended for certain people who have certain conditions, and it is recommended by the ministry in those settings. It will not, as we said before, won't be effective against the COVID virus, but it will be certainly effective against another cause of pneumonia. The one about animals is an interesting one, and there's been the odd report of it supposedly being found in, I think, in a dog, wasn't there? And you know, so it's an interesting one that we've thought about. It's not a high priority for study, but it's been thought to look at pets. But the answer is actually we don't know. I think one thing we do know is that a lot of viruses will have particular hosts they like and those that they don't. So just because they infect humans does not mean they will infect other animals.
And I think what's clear is that there's no evidence that pets play a major role in propagating this epidemic. All right, so that's not a reason for concern. If it's a phenomenon at all, it's sort of an oddity, that's sort of a footnote, kind of an interesting sort of observation, but not. It doesn't seem to have played any role in propagating this epidemic.
Thank you.
I was just more concerned about if I had given it to my dog.
Now we've got someone who's been very patient down here, and I'm coming to you.
Thanks, Peter.
Look, I really like your messaging, David, and I think we need to get more of that out, those three messages. What I'm really concerned about is the misinformation that's out there. And we get the press every morning, and as you know, there's been a lot of information in there. I was really concerned last Friday to open it up, and it tells you how to prepare yourself for going into self-isolation for 14 days and what you needed. Now, some of the stuff, totally get, but I wasn't quite sure what I was meant to do with the bucket and extra plastic bags for makeshift toilet. I wasn't quite sure what I needed to do with a backpack, a warm coat, warm walking shoes, gumboots if possible, etc, etc, etc. Now this was in Friday's paper, and obviously they've downloaded the information from Civil Defence on what you need in a natural disaster. So I got the first part about my baked beans and perhaps a couple of toilet rolls for 14 days, probably 14 toilet rolls. But what I'm saying is, look, we have got this amazing wealth of knowledge in front of us here. We've got to get these messages out correctly. I'm surrounded by elderly neighbours, and so I'm keeping an eye on them, and they asked me that same question. What do we need a bucket for, Kelly?
I don't think I can answer that question. But
I thought it might have been Ebola coming, but
yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right, and there's a wealth of information and misinformation. Quite a lot of us are saying, are not refusing any approaches by the media at the moment. We're really trying to get out there with the good messaging, and we'll continue doing that. And I think I know we've got people from the media here, just some general comments. I found overall to be quite responsible at the moment. Obviously there are exceptions, but there are real efforts to get the right messaging out there. And so, yes, it's hard, but we're doing our best. And there are some quite innovative ways, I hear, being developed to actually help with that messaging.
Any other comments from the panel on that? We are videoing this whole program here tonight, and that will be going up onto the Te Papa Hauora website. So if you think there is useful information here, tell your friends and get them to access the website, and they can have a look at what you have been privileged to hear tonight. Josh?
Yeah, I think consistent information is one of the big challenges here, and I think, as David sort of alluded to at the end, about innovations. And so I think things like applications and things, but it have to be on cell phone apps and things, are different ideas that are being explored, and so we'll see where those things go.
Okay.
Can I just add that
Sarah?
the Ministry of Health website and information is excellent, and I really would encourage everyone who's interested to actually visit that website and look at the information that's there. And the other useful point of information for patients and the public in Canterbury is our Health Info website as well, and both of those websites should have good information.
I just wanted to comment that I think this is a really good opportunity as a society to examine where we get our information from, and to teach our teenagers in particular to critically evaluate the credibility of the sources that they're reading online. And, like, social media is a great thing for keeping people connected, but it's not a source of health information, but the Ministry of Health website is. And I also want to say that my son came across this event on Reddit, which is a social media platform for those of you in the know. Interesting.
So the whole point of tonight, from Te Papa Hauora's perspective, is that we've got the University of Canterbury, the University of Otago Med School, ARA, and the Canterbury District Health Board all coming together in a very collaborative environment to get the correct messages out to the wider community. And it really is what the Health Precinct is all about. It's about facilitation and collaboration. And I think this is a superb example of what we can do in Canterbury. And I'm not sure if this has happened anywhere else in New Zealand. Now, a question here.
Not really a question, but the write-up in the paper and the press was actually for any emergency, not just the corona.
I think there was a little bit of confusion around that message.
I was just thinking, I think there may be some really good opportunities for 14 days to work out what you could do with a bucket. I was thinking Monty Python and the Holy Grail, actually. That could be a good game you could have for your kids using. Just a thought.
Just a very boring and practical question. What is the virus life on a surface?
Well, I think a lot of work's been done on related viruses, so those human coronaviruses that we know a lot about, and I think it's up to 9 days. But the important message is that that's the upper end. Okay, so usually a few days. Depends on the temperature, depends on a whole lot of factors in the surface and these sorts of things. So it can certainly survive on surfaces, but it's really susceptible to just common disinfection agents. Okay, disinfectants. So just household bleach or any other sort of common disinfectant will get rid of it, wipe out.
And the bucket is actually a good way of mixing it with the water, so you can clean up the mess that's been made by somebody else.
We knew we'd find a use for the bucket. Okay, any more questions? Here.
Do we know when an individual with COVID-19 ceases to be contagious?
The short answer is no, we don't. So we detect the virus by doing swabs of the back of people's throats and doing PCR tests, so looking for genetic presence of viral RNA, and tests that have been done on patients show that might be positive probably up to 3 weeks after onset of infection. But we don't know whether the presence of genetic material means that that patient is still infective. So we're thinking at least 7 days after onset of illness. The different countries have got slightly different recommendations, but at least 48 hours symptom-free. And most countries are instituting kind of repeat PCR testing and want to demonstrate 2 negative PCR tests before patients are considered non-infectious, but it is speculative.
Yeah, I think in a hospital setting we'd set a slightly higher bar, so we made it those extra PCR tests because the risks are sort of greater. But I think it comes back to one of the other questions earlier on, and that was around the role of asymptomatic people in spread. And it would seem that when you're asymptomatic, it's not just whether you've got the virus in the back of your throat, but whether you're coughing, whether you're symptomatic. So those symptoms are an important factor in your degree of infectiousness. Okay, so I think the Ministry of Health have taken a line, which I think is quite reasonable, that in general, if you're 48 hours after being symptom-free, your infectivity dropped off substantially. But in a hospital setting, in an ICU, and somewhere like that, we might be extra careful and do some extra tests, but we wouldn't generally recommend that in the community.
Hi there. Can you get it more than once? Like normal with you get an immunity, don't you? Can you get it again?
We don't know that. We assume there is immunity, and there's a good reason to believe that will be the case, but there's just not enough experience yet. But we're fairly confident, I think we could say that. Yeah. So, and that's the basis of a lot of the response to it, that if somebody has it, they should be immune.
I think it's hard to think of a, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's hard to think of a similar virus. Oh, you can't hear me? Oh gosh, I better speak. Can you hear me now?
Yeah. Sorry,
you couldn't hear any of that great stuff I just said before either? Oh, okay, that's a shame. We can't think of a similar virus that doesn't confer protective immunity. The reason why you get things like flu coming back every year is because the virus changes a little bit, and that's possibly something that might happen with this. But yeah, we don't know for sure.
Okay, now I'm going to come right over to this side. Why are cruise ships such good incubators? Just by the by.
Lots of people in close contact with each other.
We're expecting visitors from overseas very soon, several of whom are staying with us, coming from the US and Australia and Malaysia. So I just want some advice in the event that someone did get sick on the steps that they should take, being in a foreign country for them. They're familiar with their own health system rather than the New Zealand system. And secondly, in the event they had to self-isolate, what kinds of steps we should take for any people that, say, are staying with us.
Well, I can answer that, or the first part anyway. In the event that someone became unwell that was staying with you, you should encourage them to access care just in the same way as anyone else would whilst they're here. And that would involve phoning ahead if you thought that was sensible, so that the practice knew they were on their way. And I wouldn't envisage any particular problem in accessing care for your guests.
Thank you. Any other comment? We've got two questioners here.
When you think about the percentage of reported deaths to reported cases, how does that compare to a typical flu season?
Well, the typical, what we're seeing, I guess just a comment, there's been a lot of commentary about the what we call the case fatality rate, which is the proportion of those infected who die from it. And what we're seeing at the moment is tracking from the broad data that we're seeing is around 2% overall. Of course, we know we are better at counting the more severe end and not as good at counting the less severe end. So I think we're anticipating that may actually be overall less than that. Compared to others, I think and others correct me if I'm wrong, but in the Spanish influenza epidemic 1918-19, overall the mortality was about 3%. And the average influenza season, the proportion is much less than 1%. Anyone else want to add?
Hi, we're from an aged care facility, so we're well used to dealing with possible outbreaks, and you partly answered the question around testing. We would generally test our possible first case and then assume that any other cases were. I'm assuming we carry on with that kind of process, would we? Or would you want everybody tested? And then at what point would we be safe to come out of isolation? Because we would have 60 residents isolated. So do we wait 7 days, 14 days? Do we retest?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question. I think because we're learning more about this virus, can you hear me? Am I? Yeah, sort of. That we would probably go ahead and test more widely. So we wouldn't take the same approach that we take, for example, with norovirus, particularly when we're just encountering the first few outbreaks in that setting. So we want to be very certain about who had the disease. Over time, as we learn more about this, or if it became very prevalent, we might have to change that approach. But certainly in the first few outbreaks we encountered, we'd be wanting to test widely. And I think a facility like that would be needing a lot of support from Ramon and his team, and possibly the infection prevention team at CDHP to actually support and guide how that would be managed. So I think it would be managed kind of in a tailored approach, at least initially.
Thanks, Josh. Any other comments from the panel on that one? I've got two that have asked questions before. Have we got anyone that wants to ask a question before I... Yes, one down here, and then we'll go to the repeaters.
I think that you probably have answered this, but I do know there's a lot of questions being asked around the staff, around how quickly are we seeing the virus adapt and change. And so that is something that a number of the staff have been asking. And just a comment around moving vulnerable populations. I've just completed my thesis around this, but there is a very strong reason not to move elderly. So I do want to say to you that elderly do not do well, even when we plan it very, very well and carefully. Even if we're moving them into another room, they tend to die at a higher rate. So please think carefully, especially around the elderly. We don't tend to want to ever move them if we can possibly do that. So the question is, that mutation, I think that's one of the things that a lot of the teams are asking questions around. So I think it's whether it's appropriate or not, whether you have the answer to that. I think that's one of the questions that's been raised through our teams as well.
So Becky, is a virus mutating? Is there evidence that it's mutating?
Correct, overseas and locally. Yeah.
Yes, and I think it is. I mean, that's a question we all have. You know, we've known that other viruses have. I think the evidence so far is that we haven't seen any mutation. Is that, or there's been some regional.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I came across an interesting paper today that I must admit, there's so many papers coming out so quickly, it's hard to keep up, isn't it, David? But there is one that suggests there may be 2 variants actually, which I thought was really quite interesting. But I haven't really had a chance to, just reading it on my way over here actually, and I haven't had a chance to really delve into that. I don't think we can read too much into that at this point, but there does seem to be at least these two variants on it. I must forward that paper around, it's kind of interesting.
I mean, what we often see is that at certain times it might mutate and either increases transmissibility or decreases or behaviour changes. As one person who deals with this a lot, a person suddenly commented, well, the virus is actually doing quite well by itself without having to mutate at the moment. But yeah, so we haven't seen any major one, but obviously that's something we're all interested to see.
Thank you.
David, you mentioned the Spanish flu. I was just wondering, what stopped that in the end? How did that stop? And how do you envisage this virus will eventually stop?
Good question. Yes, I think it's fair to say that any outbreak reaches a stage when it will peter out for one reason or another, and that may be because the decreased number of susceptible people around, and it's just unable to transmit, and that's usually what happens at the end. The SARS epidemic in 2002-2003 disappeared, and there's been no human case reported since then. And that's still a mystery, although it's believed to be intensive infection prevention and control measures that help, but actually the fact that it's never reappeared is still a bit of a curiosity. Yes, anyone else want to add?
I think that essentially, for all intents and purposes, SARS was eliminated through the same sort of measures that are being imposed here. Now, we're not going to do that with this one, although it is encouraging the sort of impact that they have had in China, at least slowing and containing spread.